The sound of her pickaxe echoed through the abandoned copper mine as Sarah Mitchell descended deeper into the darkness than she'd ever gone before. What she found at the bottom of that forgotten shaft would change everything she thought she knew. But the land her family had worked for 3 generations. In 72 hours, her quiet Montana homestead would become the center of a confrontation that would test every assumption about justice, honor, and the weight of history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist still clung to the Rocky Mountain foothills when Sarah Mitchell made her way toward the old Clearwater mine. September in Montana brought crisp air that made her breath visible, and the autumn sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain her great-grandfather had first claimed in 1887. At 34, Sarah had inherited more than just the 2,000-acre ranch. She'd inherited the restless spirit that drove the Mitchell family to always push a little further, dig a little deeper. The Clearwater mine had been abandoned since 1952, when the copper veins finally played out and the mining company pulled their equipment. For decades, it had sat like a wound in the earth, its entrance partially collapsed and overgrown with wild Montana grass and scraggly pine. Most folks in the nearby town of Cedar Falls had forgotten it existed, but Sarah remembered the stories her grandfather used to tell about the fortune that might still be hidden in its depths. Financial pressures had been mounting on the ranch. For months, cattle prices had dropped, and the bank was making increasingly urgent calls about the mortgage payments. Sarah's husband had left 2 years earlier, unable to handle the isolation and constant struggle of ranch life, taking their savings and leaving her with nothing but debt and determination. She'd sold most of the livestock, but it wasn't enough. The mine represented her last hope, a desperate gamble that somewhere in those dark tunnels lay enough copper or precious metals to save everything her family had built. She'd been exploring the mine for 3 weeks, working in the early morning hours before tending to the remaining cattle and the daily ranch work. The entrance had required extensive clearing, and she'd reinforced the tunnel with timber as she went deeper. Modern mining equipment was beyond her budget, so she relied on traditional tools, pickaxe, shovel, and battery-powered lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. This particular morning felt different. She'd followed a promising vein of ore the day before, and the rock samples she'd collected showed traces of silver mixed with the copper, potentially valuable enough to make the dangerous work worthwhile. The tunnel branched in several directions about 200 feet from the entrance, and she'd been systematically exploring each passage. The third branch angled sharply downward, requiring her to use a rope to maintain her footing on the loose shale. Her lantern beam revealed that this passage was different from the others, older, with tool marks that didn't match the industrial mining equipment of the early 1900s. The walls showed signs of hand excavation, as if someone had dug this section with primitive tools many decades before the official mining operation began. 50 feet down the sloping passage, her light caught something that made her freeze. A section of the tunnel wall had partially collapsed, creating an opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. But it wasn't the opening itself that stopped her cold. It was what lay visible just beyond it. Human bones, yellowed, with age, scattered across the floor of a small chamber beyond the collapse. Sarah's heart hammered as she squeezed through the opening, her lantern revealing a scene that defied immediate understanding. The chamber was roughly circular, about 10 feet across, with walls that showed clear evidence of deliberate excavation. But this wasn't a mining operation. The walls were smooth, almost ceremonial in their precision. 7 skeletons lay arranged in a rough circle, their bones interspersed with artifacts that made Sarah's archaeological training from her college years surged to the surface. Beaded jewelry, what appeared to be ceremonial knives, and pottery fragments suggested these remains were far older than the official mining operation. These people had been here long before her great-grandfather ever claimed this land. But it was the eighth figure that made her blood run cold. In the center of the circle, partially buried under decades of fallen debris, lay the skeleton of a child. Unlike the others, this skeleton wore remnants of more recent clothing, faded blue fabric that might have been denim, and the unmistakable glint of metal buttons that couldn't be more than 60 or 70 years old. Sarah approached carefully, her anthropology training warring with the urgency she felt to understand what she was seeing. The child's remains told a story of violence. The skull showed clear signs of trauma, and the bones were positioned in a way that suggested the body had been placed, not fallen naturally. Around the small skeleton, arranged with obvious care, were items that seemed to bridge centuries: traditional Lakota beadwork alongside a modern pocket watch, eagle feathers next to what appeared to be a small metal toy truck. As she knelt beside the child's remains, her lantern illuminated something that made her gasp. Clutched in the small skeleton's hand was a piece of paper, miraculously preserved by the dry air of the chamber. With trembling fingers, she carefully extracted it, unfolding what appeared to be a letter written in a child's careful handwriting. "My name is Thomas Running Bear," the letter began in English. "I'm 10 years old. If someone finds this, please tell my grandfather, Joseph Running Bear, that I tried to come home. I tried to be brave like he taught me, but the men from the school brought me back here. They said no one would look for an Indian boy in the old sacred cave. They were wrong about that, but they were right that no one would look for me soon enough." Sarah's hands shook as she continued reading. The letter described how Thomas had been taken from the government boarding school in Cedar Falls, where Lakota children were sent to be civilized. He'd been caught trying to escape back to his family on the reservation, and rather than return him to the school for punishment, someone had decided on a more permanent solution. The letter mentioned 3 men by name, all surnames that Sarah recognized as belonging to prominent Cedar Falls families, including the family that had owned the mining operation. The final paragraph of the letter was the most haunting. "I know about the old ones buried here. Grandfather told me this was a sacred place where our people came to die with honor when the soldiers chased them into the mountains. I am not afraid to join them, but I want my family to know I never forgot who I am. My spirit name is Soaring Hawk, and I will wait here until my people come to take me home." The letter was dated September 15th, 1954. Sarah sat back on her heels, the implications crashing over her like a mountain avalanche. This wasn't just an archaeological discovery. It was evidence of a murder that had been covered up for nearly 70 years. A child had been killed and hidden in a place the perpetrators assumed no one would ever look. A place they probably didn't even realize was already a burial ground sacred to the Lakota people. She looked around the chamber with new eyes, understanding now what she was seeing. This wasn't a random cave, it was a traditional burial site, probably used by Lakota families fleeing the cavalry in the 1870s and 1880s. The 7 adult skeletons weren't victims of violence, but people who had chosen to die with dignity in a sacred place rather than submit to capture and life on a reservation. Thomas Running Bear had been brought here not just to hide his murder, but in a grotesque mockery of his own people's traditions. The killers had probably thought they were being clever, hiding the body in a place they assumed was just another abandoned cave. They had no idea they were desecrating a site that held profound spiritual significance. Sarah carefully folded the letter and placed it in her jacket pocket. Every instinct told her to immediately contact the police, but she also understood that this discovery was bigger than a simple criminal investigation. This was about justice that had been delayed for 7 decades, about a child who had died alone calling for his grandfather, about sacred ground that had been violated and then forgotten. She began photographing everything with her phone, documenting the position of each skeleton, the artifacts, the tool marks on the walls. Her archaeological training kicked in as she realized she was potentially disturbing a crime scene, but also that proper documentation might be the only way to ensure that Thomas Running Bear's story was finally told correctly. As she worked, Sarah found herself thinking about the letter's mention of Thomas's grandfather, Joseph Running Bear. If the boy had been 10 years old in 1954, his grandfather might have been in his 40s or 50s then. There was a chance, a small one, that Joseph might still be alive now in his 120s. More likely, his descendants were still living on one of the Montana reservations. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a mountain storm. She held in her hands evidence of a murder, the desecration of a sacred site, and the final words of a child who had died calling for his family. The question was no longer whether to contact authorities, but how to ensure that Thomas Running Bear finally got the justice he had died waiting for. Sarah spent another hour in the chamber, carefully documenting everything she could see. She collected small samples of the artifacts for potential dating, though she already knew the story they told. This discovery would change everything, not just for her financially struggling ranch, but for the communities whose histories had intersected in this hidden place. When she finally climbed back up to ground level, the Montana sun was already high overhead. The normal sounds of ranch life, cattle lowing in the distance, wind through the pine trees, seemed surreal after what she'd discovered in the depths of the earth. She stood at the mine entrance, looking out over the land her family had worked for generations, and wondered how many other secrets lay buried beneath the surface. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with Thomas Running Bear's letter spread before her, researching everything she could find about the 1954 Indian boarding school system and the families mentioned in the boy's final message. What she found painted a picture of systematic abuse and cultural destruction that made her stomach turn, but also gave context to the desperate escape attempt that had cost Thomas his life. She also began searching for information about Joseph Running Bear and his descendants. The internet made what would have been impossible research just decades earlier relatively straightforward. By midnight, she had identified 3 men living on the Crow Reservation who shared the Running Bear surname and appeared to be the right age to be Thomas's relatives. Sarah made her decision as the grandfather clock in her hallway chimed 1 a.m. She would contact the Running Bear family first, before involving law enforcement. Thomas had died calling for his grandfather, and after nearly 70 years, his family deserved to hear his story before anyone else. They deserved the chance to bring him home on their own terms. What Sarah didn't know, as she finally turned off her computer and headed to bed, was that her phone calls to the reservation would set in motion events that would bring the past and present together in ways she never could have imagined. In 3 days, the quiet Montana ranch would witness a confrontation that would honor both the sacred traditions of the Lakota people and the determination of a grandfather who had never stopped looking for his grandson. The phone rang 4 times before a deep, weathered voice answered, "Running Bear residence." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah gripped her coffee mug tighter, her heart pounding as she sat in her kitchen at 6 a.m., surrounded by printed articles about the Crow Reservation and notes she'd scribbled through the sleepless night. "Hello, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm calling from Cedar Falls, Montana. I believe I may have information about a family member of yours who disappeared many years ago." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the connection had dropped. Finally, the voice responded, carefully measured. "What kind of information?" "About Thomas Running Bear, a boy who would have been around 10 years old in 1954. This time, The silence was different, charged with an electricity that made Sarah's skin prickle. She could hear breathing, the sound of someone moving, maybe sitting down heavily. "Who is this again?" The man's voice had changed, becoming sharp with an emotion Sarah couldn't identify. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I own a ranch near Cedar Falls, and yesterday I found something in an old mine on my property, something that belonged to Thomas." Sarah took a deep breath. "Sir, I found a letter written in his hand. He wrote it shortly before he died." The phone clattered as if it had been dropped, followed by muffled voices speaking rapidly in what Sarah assumed was Lakota. After several minutes, a different voice came on the line, younger, speaking English with crisp precision. "Ms. Mitchell, this is David Running Bear. You're speaking to my great-uncle William Running Bear. Thomas Running Bear was his older brother. What exactly did you find?" Sarah closed her eyes, knowing that the next few minutes would change everything for the family on the other end of the line. "I found Thomas's remains in a burial chamber deep in an abandoned copper mine. He left a letter explaining what happened to him. He was murdered, Mr. Running Bear. Someone killed him and hid his body in what they didn't realize was a sacred burial site." The younger voice was quiet for a long moment. "Can you read us the letter?" With shaking hands, Sarah unfolded Thomas's final message and read it word by word, her voice breaking several times as she repeated the child's brave attempt to maintain his identity even in the face of death. When she finished, the silence on the other end was profound. Finally, William Running Bear's voice returned to the phone, but now it carried a strength that made Sarah sit up straighter. "Young lady, you have given us a gift we never thought we would receive. For 69 years our family has wondered what happened to Thomas. We searched everywhere. We never stopped looking. The letter mentions your father, Joseph Running Bear," Sarah said carefully. "My father died in 1989, William replied. He was 93 years old, and not a day passed that he didn't speak Thomas's name. He organized search parties for 10 years after Thomas disappeared. He confronted school officials, town authorities, even traveled to Washington, D.C. to demand answers. No one would help him. They said Thomas was just another runaway Indian boy who would turn up eventually." David's voice returned to the phone. "Ms. Mitchell, we need to come get our brother. We need to bring him home properly. Can you tell us exactly where you found him?" Sarah described the location of the mine, the chamber, and the arrangement of the burial site. As she spoke, she could hear David taking detailed notes, asking specific questions about access roads and the condition of Thomas's remains. His questions revealed a thorough understanding of both forensic procedures and traditional burial customs. "There's something else you need to know," Sarah continued. "The letter names 3 men from Cedar Falls who were involved in Thomas's death. The surnames are Patterson, Whitmore, and Kowalski. These were prominent families in town during the 1950s. "We know those names," William said, his voice hard as granite. "Patterson owned the mine where you found Thomas. Whitmore was the superintendent of the boarding school. Kowalski was the sheriff who refused to investigate when Thomas disappeared." "Are any of them still alive?" "Sons and grandsons," David answered. "The families still live in Cedar Falls. They still run the town, just like their fathers and grandfathers did." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you going to do?" "We're going to bring Thomas home," William said simply. "And we're going to make sure the truth is finally told." "When?" Sarah asked. "Tomorrow. We'll be there tomorrow." After ending the call, Sarah spent the morning contacting the local sheriff's department and the FBI field office in Billings. The response was frustratingly bureaucratic. Jurisdictional questions, evidence protocols, the complexities of investigating a 70-year-old murder. Detective Ray Morrison from the Cedar Falls Sheriff's Department agreed to meet her at the ranch that afternoon, but his tone suggested he viewed the whole situation as more inconvenience than breakthrough. Morrison arrived in a dusty patrol car just after lunch, a heavy-set man in his 50s with graying hair and skeptical eyes. Sarah led him to the mine entrance, watching his expression grow increasingly serious as she explained what she'd found. "You disturbed a potential crime scene," he said when she finished describing her documentation efforts. "I'm an archaeologist by training," Sarah replied evenly. "I documented everything before I moved anything. The scene is preserved." Morrison's radio crackled with routine traffic as they descended into the mine. Sarah had installed battery-powered LED strips along the main tunnel, making the journey easier than her initial exploration. When they reached the burial chamber, Morrison's skepticism evaporated. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his flashlight beam playing over the arranged skeletons and artifacts. "How long has this been here?" The adult remains appear to be from the 1870s or 1880s, based on the artifacts and the tool marks in the chamber. The walls. This was likely a traditional Lakota burial site for people fleeing cavalry units. Sarah pointed to Thomas's remains, but the child's body was placed here much later, 1954 according to his letter. Morrison read Thomas's letter with the slow concentration of someone unaccustomed to dealing with historical documents. When he finished, his face was pale. These names. My God, these are the founding families of Cedar Falls. The Running Bear family is coming tomorrow to claim their relative, Sarah informed him. They've been searching for him for almost 70 years. Now hold on, Morrison said, his official demeanor returning. This is a crime scene. We can't just turn over evidence to what? To the victim's family? Sarah's voice carried an edge she didn't try to hide. Detective Morrison, this child died calling for his grandfather. His family has spent 7 decades not knowing what happened to him. They have the right to take him home. There are procedures, protocols. The state medical examiner needs to examine the remains. The FBI might want to investigate since this involves federal property and Native American remains. Sarah studied Morrison's face, reading the conflict there. How long have you lived in Cedar Falls, Detective? All my life. Why? Did you know any of these families? Patterson, Whitmore, Kowalski? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Stan Patterson runs the hardware store. His grandfather built half the businesses in town. The Whitmores own the newspaper. Sheriff Kowalski was my predecessor. I got my start, working under his son. And now you know they were involved in murdering a 10-year-old boy. Allegedly involved, according to a letter written by a child under extreme duress. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. That child is still here, Detective. His bones tell the story of how he died. The forensic evidence will support everything. In that letter, Morrison sighed heavily. Mrs. Mitchell, you don't understand the position this puts me in. These families, they have deep roots in this community. Accusations like this could tear the town apart. The truth could tear the town apart, Sarah corrected, but not telling it has already done that. It just happened slowly, over 70 years, instead of all at once. They climbed back to the surface in uncomfortable silence. Morrison spent another hour examining the mine entrance and taking official photographs, but Sarah could see his heart wasn't in the investigation. He was already calculating how to minimize the damage to his community's reputation. I'll need you to secure this site, Morrison finally said. No one else goes down there until the state investigators arrive. When will that be? Could be days. Could be weeks. These things take time. Sarah watched Morrison's patrol car disappear down her access road, dust hanging in the air long after the engine noise faded. She understood now that justice for Thomas Running Bear wouldn't come through official channels, at least not quickly or easily. Too many people had too much invested in keeping the past buried. That evening she made a second call to the Running Bear family. David answered on the first ring. The local sheriff came out today, Sarah reported. He's treating this as a bureaucratic problem rather than a murder investigation. He wants to seal off the site until state investigators can take over, which could take weeks or months. We expected that, David said. We've dealt with law enforcement reluctance before, but Miss Mitchell, you need to understand something. We're not coming alone tomorrow. What do you mean? When word spread through the reservation about Thomas being found, about the letter, about what really happened to him, people started making phone calls, not just here on the Crow Reservation, but to Lakota communities across Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota. Thomas's story isn't unique. Every family has stories like his, children who disappeared into the boarding school system and were never seen again. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. How many people are coming? Grandfather Joseph Running Bear had 4 sons. Thomas was the youngest. The other 3 had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Tomorrow, 5 generations of the Running Bear family will come to bring Thomas home, and they won't be coming alone. David, I want to help, but I'm worried about what might happen if this becomes a confrontation. Miss Mitchell, this won't be a confrontation. This will be a ceremony. We're coming to collect our family member and to honor the sacred site where he was placed. But we're also coming to make sure the truth about what happened to him is known by everyone in Cedar Falls. The town won't like that. The town has had 70 years to like the truth. Tomorrow, they'll have to live with it. After ending the call, Sarah walked out to the mine entrance in the gathering dusk. The September air was turning cold, and she could smell wood smoke from neighbors preparing for winter. She thought about Thomas Running Bear, alone in the dark chamber for 7 decades, waiting for his family to find him. Tomorrow would bring answers, but also consequences she couldn't predict. The weight of discovery had shifted from her shoulders to something much larger. The collision of past and present, the demand for justice long delayed, and the reckoning that communities sometimes face when their buried secrets finally surface. Sarah spent the evening preparing her ranch for visitors, though she had no idea how many would come or what would happen when they arrived. She cleared the main access road, ensured her water systems could handle additional people, and gathered all her documentation about the discovery into organized files. As she worked, her phone rang repeatedly. Word was spreading through Cedar, falls about the discovery in the mine. Neighbors called with questions she couldn't answer. Reporters from the local newspaper wanted statements she wasn't ready to give, and town officials left messages expressing concern about the situation developing on her property. By 10 p.m., she had stopped answering the phone entirely. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and she needed to rest before facing whatever the Running Bear family's arrival would bring to her quiet Montana ranch. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of vehicles approaching her ranch. Through her bedroom window, she could see headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, more than she had expected. As she dressed quickly and made coffee, the sounds multiplied. Car doors closing, voices speaking in hushed tones, the distinctive rhythm of Lakota being spoken among the gathering group. When she stepped onto her front porch at sunrise, Sarah stopped in amazement. Nearly 50 people had assembled in her front yard, ranging from elderly men and women wrapped in traditional blankets to young adults with modern clothes and ancient faces. Pickup trucks, SUVs, and sedans formed a rough semicircle around her house, their occupants organizing themselves with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to communal action. At the center of the group stood a man Sarah immediately recognized as William Running Bear. Though he was in his 80s, his back remained straight and his eyes sharp as winter stars. Beside him, a younger man, she assumed, was David, unpacked what appeared to be ceremonial items from the back of a pickup truck. Sage bundles, eagle feathers, and a drum that looked old enough to have been crafted by hands that remembered the buffalo herds. Miss Mitchell, William called out as she approached. His voice carried clearly across the gathering, causing conversations to quiet. Thank you for welcoming us to your land. "You're welcome here," Sarah replied, meaning it more than any words she'd ever spoken. "Thomas has been waiting for you." An elderly woman stepped forward, her grey hair braided with ribbons and her face marked with lines that spoke of decades spent squinting against prairie wind. "I am Margaret Running Bear, Thomas's cousin. We have brought everything necessary to take him home properly." Sarah nodded toward the mine entrance. "I should warn you. Detective Morrison from the Sheriff's Department wants the site secured. Until state investigators arrive, he may try to prevent you from accessing the burial chamber." William's expression didn't change, but several of the younger men exchanged glances that Sarah couldn't interpret. "We understand the complications," he said simply. "We also understand our obligations to our family and our ancestors." As the group began organizing their ceremonial preparations, Sarah heard the rumble of more vehicles approaching. These sounds were different, heavier engines, more aggressive in their approach. A convoy of Sheriff's Department vehicles, county, cars, and what appeared to be federal SUVs crested the hill leading to her ranch, their emergency lights flashing against the morning sky. Detective Morrison stepped out of the lead vehicle, followed by a woman in a severe suit who immediately began surveying the assembled Native Americans with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to managing volatile situations. Behind them, Sarah counted at least 12 law enforcement officers, their hands resting unconsciously near their weapons as they assessed the gathering. "Ms. Mitchell," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. "I thought I made it clear that this site was to remain secure." Before Sarah could respond, William Running Bear stepped forward. "Detective Morrison, I am William Running Bear. Thomas Running Bear was my brother. We have come to take him home." The woman in the suit moved to Morrison's shoulder. "I'm Agent Jennifer Crawford, FBI. This site is now under federal jurisdiction, pending investigation of potential violations of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. I'm going to need everyone to disperse immediately." A murmur ran through the assembled Native Americans, not of fear but of recognition. These were people who had heard similar words before, who understood that federal authority was often the last refuge of those seeking to maintain control over inconvenient truths. David Running Bear stepped forward, holding a folder thick with documents. "Agent Crawford, we're prepared to provide you with genealogical documentation proving our relationship to Thomas Running Bear. We're also prepared to demonstrate that this site contains the remains of our ancestors, making it subject to federal protection under NAGPRA." Crawford accepted the folder but didn't open it. Regardless of family relationships, this is now a crime scene. Federal investigators need to process the evidence before any remains can be released. "How long?" William asked, his voice steady, but carrying undertones that made several of the law enforcement officers shift nervously. "Weeks, possibly months." The silence that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something much more powerful, the collective weight of generations of patients exhausted, of promises broken, of children who had disappeared into systems designed to erase them, and families who had never stopped searching. Margaret Running Bear broke the silence, her voice carrying the authority of age and loss. "Agent Crawford, for 69 years we have waited for news of this child. For 69 years we have trusted law enforcement to help us find him. For 69 years we have been told to be patient, to follow procedures, to wait for justice. We are done waiting." Crawford's hand moved toward her radio. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but—" "You understand nothing," William interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. "You see a law enforcement problem. We see a child who died calling for his grandfather, who has waited 7 decades to come home to his people." Sarah watched the tension escalate, realizing that everything was about to spiral beyond anyone's control. The federal agents were outnumbered but armed and operating under the assumption that their authority was absolute, the Running Bear family. And their allies were operating under spiritual obligations that transcended human law. "There's another way," Sarah said loudly, stepping between the two groups. "Agent Crawford, you're concerned about evidence preservation and proper procedures. The Running Bear family is concerned about bringing their relative home and honoring the sacred site where he was placed. What if we could do both?" Both groups turned toward her, and Sarah felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. "The burial chamber contains the remains of 8 people," she continued. 7 adults who appear to have died in the 1870s or 1880s, and Thomas, who died in 1954. The letter Thomas left clearly identifies his killers and explains what happened. "To him, the forensic evidence will support his account." Crawford nodded slowly. "That's correct, which is why we need to process everything properly." "But what if the Running Bear family supervised the recovery?" Sarah pressed. "What if they participated in the investigation, ensuring that both their spiritual obligations and your evidentiary requirements were met?" Detective Morrison shook his head. "That's not how investigations work. We can't have family members contaminating evidence." David Running Bear stepped forward again, and Sarah noticed for the first time that he wore a small pin on his jacket, the seal of the Montana State University Anthropology Department. "Detective Morrison, I have a PhD in forensic anthropology from MSU. My dissertation was on the analysis of historical Native American burial sites. I'm not just family. I'm also qualified to participate in the investigation as a consulting expert." The revelation clearly caught the law enforcement officers off guard. Agent Crawford studied David with new interest, while Morrison looked like he'd been presented with a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. "Furthermore," David continued, "under NAGPRA, Native American remains and associated artifacts must be repatriated to affiliated tribes. The law requires consultation with tribal representatives throughout the investigation process. You can't legally proceed without our involvement." Margaret Running Bear moved to stand beside her grandson, her presence adding ceremonial weight to his academic credentials. "We are not asking you to ignore evidence or abandon your investigation. We are asking you to remember that Thomas Running Bear was a child who died in terror, whose spirit has waited 7 decades to return to his people. Your procedures must honor both justice and the sacred." Sarah watched Agent Crawford's expression shift as she calculated the legal and political implications of the situation. A federal investigation that excluded the victim's family would face immediate legal challenges. A confrontation that resulted in violence against Native Americans seeking to reclaim their child would create a public relations nightmare. "What exactly are you proposing?" Crawford asked finally. William Running Bear spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to negotiating with federal officials. "We propose a joint investigation. Your forensic experts and ours work together to document everything in the burial chamber. Thomas's remains and any artifacts belonging to him are released to us for proper burial. The remains of our ancestors in the chamber are repatriated immediately. Your investigation into the 1954 murder proceeds with our full cooperation. And if the investigation identifies living suspects, then they face justice. But justice is determined by a court of law, not by a cover-up disguised as bureaucratic procedure." Agent Crawford conferred quietly with Detective Morrison and the other federal agents for several minutes. Sarah could see them weighing options, calculating risks, considering precedents. Finally, Crawford returned to the group. "Dr. Running Bear, I'm prepared to offer you consulting status on this investigation, provided you agree to follow federal protocols and evidence handling procedures." "Agreed." "Mr. Running Bear, I can authorize the immediate repatriation of the pre-1900 remains, provided they're documented before removal." agreed. Thomas Running Bear's remains will be released to your family once the initial forensic analysis is complete. I estimate 72 hours. William Running Bear looked at his assembled family, reading expressions and receiving nods that spoke of collective decision-making processes older than the Constitution. 72 hours, he agreed. But we will maintain a presence here. Until then, we will not leave Thomas alone again. Crawford nodded slowly. That's acceptable, but I want to be clear, this is a murder investigation. If our forensic analysis reveals evidence pointing to living suspects or their families, we will pursue prosecution regardless of their standing in the community. That is what we want, Margaret Running Bear said simply. That is what Thomas died asking for. As the two groups began the complex process of organizing a joint investigation, Sarah realized that something unprecedented was happening on her Montana ranch. Law enforcement and Native American families were collaborating. Instead of confronting each other, federal authority was bending to accommodate spiritual obligations. Justice delayed for 70 years was finally beginning to move forward. But as she watched Detective Morrison's uncomfortable expression and noticed how several of the federal agents kept glancing toward the road leading to Cedar Falls, Sarah understood that the real confrontation was still coming. Word of Thomas Running Bear's discovery and the presence of 50 Native Americans on her ranch would spread through the town like wildfire. The families whose ancestors had murdered Thomas and covered up his death would not react passively to the threat of exposure. The gathering storm was about to break, and when it did, everyone present would discover whether justice could survive the collision between past and present, between truth and the comfortable lies communities tell themselves to sleep at night. By noon, the joint investigation was underway. Federal agents and Running Bear family members worked side by side in the burial chamber, documenting everything with a thoroughness that honored both legal requirements and spiritual obligations. Above ground, the remaining family members had established what amounted to a camp, complete with cooking areas, ceremonial spaces, and sleeping arrangements that suggested they were prepared to stay as long as necessary. Sarah found herself serving as liaison between the various groups. Her ranch transformed into something she'd never imagined, a place where historical justice and modern law enforcement were attempting to find common ground. But as she watched the careful excavation work and listened to the quiet conversations in both English and Lakota, she couldn't shake the feeling that the most difficult challenges lay ahead. The forensic work in the burial chamber revealed horrors that went far beyond what Thomas Running Bear's letter had described. Dr. David Running Bear worked alongside FBI forensic specialist Dr. Amanda Torres, their combined expertise painting a picture of systematic violence that made even the hardened federal agents pause in their documentation. Thomas's skeletal remains told a story of prolonged suffering before death. Multiple healed fractures suggested months of abuse at the boarding school, while the fatal trauma to his skull indicated he had been struck repeatedly with a heavy object. But it was the positioning of his body that revealed the calculated cruelty. Of his killers, he had been placed in the chamber while still alive, left to die slowly in the darkness. The pattern of injuries suggests he survived for at least 12 hours after being placed here, Dr. Torres explained to Agent Crawford as they reviewed the preliminary findings. The scratches on the chamber walls near his body indicate he tried to dig his way out. David Running Bear studied the evidence with the dispassionate analysis of a trained scientist, but Sarah could see the emotional toll in the tightness around his eyes. The perpetrators knew about this chamber, he said quietly. The way they positioned Thomas's body shows familiarity with traditional burial practices. This wasn't random. It was deliberately chosen to mock our customs. Above ground, the joint investigation had attracted unwanted attention. Throughout the afternoon, vehicles had been stopping along the county road that bordered Sarah's property, their occupants watching the activity with binoculars and telephoto lenses. Local television news crews had set up equipment just beyond the property line, broadcasting live updates about the standoff between federal agents and Native American activists. The characterization infuriated Sarah, who watched the coverage from her kitchen while preparing food for the investigators. The news reports completely ignored the collaborative nature of the investigation, instead focusing on dramatic imagery of armed federal agents and militant Native Americans. The coverage painted the Running Bear family as potential threats rather than grieving relatives seeking justice for a murdered child. By evening, the media attention had drawn counter-protesters from Cedar Falls. A group of about 20 townspeople gathered at the end of Sarah's access road, carrying signs reading "Respect private property" and "Support local law enforcement." Their presence created a tense buffer zone between the investigation site and the growing crowd of curiosity seekers. Sarah noticed that several of the counter-protesters bore familiar surnames: Patterson, Whitmore, and Kowalski descendants who had grown up hearing sanitized versions of their family histories. Their presence wasn't coincidental. It was a coordinated response to the threat of exposure their families now faced. Detective Morrison approached Sarah as she distributed sandwiches to the investigative teams. His expression was troubled, and she could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes. "Miss Mitchell, I need to ask you about something we found in the chamber," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. There were additional artifacts near Thomas's body that weren't mentioned in his letter, personal items that appeared to belong to other children. Sarah felt her blood turn cold. What kind of items? Morrison opened an evidence bag containing small objects, a child's bracelet, glasses with a distinctive 1950s frame style, and a small wooden cross on a chain. Dr. Torres believes these belong to other victims, children who may have died in that chamber. Are you saying Thomas wasn't the only one? We're saying the evidence suggests a pattern of violence spanning several years. The forensic team wants to expand the search to other areas of the mine, but that would require shutting down the current investigation and bringing in ground-penetrating radar equipment. Sarah looked toward the burial chamber entrance, where David Running Bear was emerging with another load of carefully documented artifacts. "Have you told the family?" "Not yet. Agent Crawford wants to complete the analysis of Thomas's remains before expanding the scope. She's concerned about public reaction if word gets out that there may be additional victims." "Public reaction?" Sarah's voice carried an edge of anger. "Detective Morrison, if there are other children buried in that mine, their families have the same right to know that the Running Bear family did. How many decades are we supposed to wait for the convenient time to tell the truth?" Morrison's radio crackled with a call from dispatch, interrupting their conversation. Sarah listened as the dispatcher reported increasing tensions at the access road, with the crowd of townspeople growing larger and more agitated as word spread about the investigation's findings. "Sheriff Morrison, we've got Stan Patterson here demanding to speak with the federal agents," the dispatcher continued. "He's claiming his family is being slandered by this investigation and wants to file a complaint." Sarah watched Morrison's face as he processed this information. Stan Patterson owned the hardware store in Cedar Falls, just as his grandfather had owned the copper mine where Thomas died. His arrival meant the families named in Thomas's letter were moving from passive observation to active resistance. "Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes, Morrison replied into his radio. He looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. "Ms. Mitchell, things are about to get complicated. More complicated than they already are. Stan Patterson isn't just the hardware store owner. He's also the mayor of Cedar Falls, and his family has significant influence with the county commissioners and state legislators. If he's here making formal complaints, it means the families are organizing a coordinated response. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. What kind of response? The kind that could shut down this investigation before we find all the answers. As Morrison walked toward his patrol car, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of staying on her ranch and letting others control the narrative, she would go to Cedar Falls herself. If the families were organizing to protect their secrets, the community needed to hear the truth directly from someone who couldn't be dismissed as an outside agitator. She found William Running Bear sitting beside a small fire, discussing something in Lakota with several of the elder family members. When she approached, he looked up with eyes that seemed to see through her intentions to the determination beneath. "You're thinking of going to town," he said. It wasn't a question. The families, named in Thomas's letter, are trying to shut down the investigation. People in Cedar Falls need to understand what really happened, and they need to hear it from someone they can't dismiss as having an agenda. "And you think they'll listen to you?" Sarah considered the question honestly. "I think they'll have to. My family has been part of this community for 4 generations. They can't write me off as an outsider or an activist. When I tell them what Thomas wrote in his letter, they'll have to confront the truth about their own history." Margaret Running Bear leaned forward, her weathered hands warming over the fire. "Child, what you're proposing is dangerous. These families have kept their secrets for 70 years. They won't give them up easily. But Thomas died asking for justice. If I don't speak for him, who will?" William Running Bear studied Sarah's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "David will go with you, and 2 of our young men. If you're determined to face these people, you won't do it alone. That might make things worse. A group of Native Americans confronting the town will make clear that Thomas Running Bear has family who refuse to be silenced," William interrupted. "We've spent 70 years being patient and polite while seeking justice for our children. Tonight, we stand with those who stand with us." An hour later, Sarah found herself driving towards Cedar Falls in the passenger seat of David Running Bear's pickup truck, accompanied by 2 young Lakota men who introduced themselves as Thomas's great-nephews. The lights of the town appeared. Ahead, like a constellation fallen to earth, deceptively peaceful in the Montana darkness. The Cedar Falls Community Center was packed beyond capacity when they arrived, with overflow crowds spilling into the parking lot and adjacent streets. Word had spread through the small town with the speed that only comes when long-buried secrets threaten to surface. Sarah could see faces she'd known her entire life. Neighbors, former classmates, family friends, all gathered to confront a truth they'd never had to face before. Mayor Stan Patterson stood at the podium, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being heard. His voice carried easily over the crowd as Sarah and her companions entered the back of the room. "Outside agitators using this tragedy to attack our community and our families," Patterson was saying. "These accusations against deceased community members who can't defend themselves represent the worst kind of character assassination." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Sarah noticed it wasn't universal. Some faces showed uncertainty, confusion, the dawning awareness that they might not know their community's history as well as they'd assumed. The federal investigation is based on nothing more than a child's desperate letter, written under circumstances we can't verify, Patterson continued. "We cannot allow our town's reputation to be destroyed by unsubstantiated allegations against families who helped build Cedar Falls." Sarah began moving through the crowd toward the front of the room, David Running Bear and the 2 young men following closely behind. Conversations quieted as people recognized her, whispers spreading as They noticed her Native American companions. Furthermore, Patterson said, his voice rising to maintain control of the room, this entire situation has been manufactured by outside interests seeking to exploit our community for political purposes. The so-called evidence, the evidence is a murdered child who spent 70 years waiting for someone to tell his story. Sarah's voice cut through Patterson's speech like a blade, causing heads to turn throughout the packed room. She stepped into the center aisle, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the building. I found Thomas Running Bear's body in the Clearwater mine on my property, she continued, walking toward the front of the room as silence spread through the crowd. I read his letter, written in his own hand, describing how he was murdered by your grandfather, Stan Patterson, along with Superintendent Whitmore and Sheriff Kowalski. The room erupted in shocked voices and angry denials, but Sarah pressed forward, her voice rising above the chaos. Thomas was 10 years old. He was trying to escape the boarding school and return to his family when he was caught. Instead of returning him to the school, 3 prominent citizens of Cedar Falls decided to solve their Indian problem permanently. That's enough, Patterson shouted into his microphone, his face flushed with anger. Security, remove these people from the building. But David Running Bear stepped forward, his doctorate credentials and professional bearing giving him an authority that cut through the emotional chaos. Mayor Patterson, I'm Dr. David Running Bear, Thomas Running Bear's great-nephew and a consulting forensic anthropologist with the FBI investigation. The evidence we've recovered supports every detail in Thomas's letter, including the identification of his killers. The room fell into stunned silence as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about historical accusations. It was about a federal murder investigation with living suspects and documented evidence. Sarah seized the moment of quiet to deliver the words that would change Cedar Falls forever. Thomas Running Bear died calling for his grandfather, asking his family to remember that his spirit name was Soaring Hawk. For 70 years he waited in the darkness while your families built their lives on the foundation of his murder. Tonight, his wait is over. Tomorrow he goes home to his people, and the truth about what happened to him will finally be told. The community center erupted into chaos following Sarah's revelation. Voices rose in angry denial, shocked questions, and heated arguments as neighbors turned on each other with accusations and defenses. Mayor Patterson hammered his gavel repeatedly, his face crimson as he struggled to maintain control over a room that had become a powder keg of 70 years' worth of suppressed truth. Order! Order! Patterson shouted over the din. I will not allow this meeting to be hijacked by inflammatory accusations. Inflammatory? David Running Bear's voice cut through the noise with the precision of someone accustomed to academic debate. Mayor Patterson, are you calling the murder of a 10-year-old child inflammatory, or are you calling the evidence inflammatory? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Sarah watched faces throughout the room as people processed the distinction, seeing some expressions shift from defensive anger to uncomfortable uncertainty. An elderly woman in the third row stood up, her voice shaky but determined. Stan Patterson, I'm 87 years old, and I remember when Thomas Running Bear disappeared. I remember the search parties that went out looking for him. And I remember how your grandfather convinced everyone to stop looking because the boy had probably run off to another reservation. Mrs. Henderson, you're remembering things that happened nearly 70 years ago. I'm remembering them just fine, Stan Patterson. And I'm remembering other children who disappeared from that boarding school. Children whose families were told they'd run away or been sent to schools in other states. How many of them ended up in that mine? The room fell silent as the implications of Mrs. Henderson's words sank in. Sarah felt David Running Bear tense beside her, and she knew he was thinking about the additional artifacts they'd found in the burial chamber. Sheriff Morrison entered the community center at that moment, his radio crackling with urgent traffic. He approached Patterson with an expression that made several people in the front rows lean forward to hear their whispered conversation. Patterson's face went pale as Morrison spoke. When the sheriff finished, Patterson stepped back to the microphone, with hands that visibly trembled. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed that the FBI investigation has identified additional evidence at the mine site. Federal agents are requesting that anyone with historical information about missing children from the Cedar Falls Indian boarding school contact the authorities immediately." The silence that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. In a public meeting, it wasn't the quiet of people waiting for more information. It was the silence of a community suddenly understanding that their comfortable version of history was crumbling around them. A man in his 40s stood up near the middle of the room, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone turn toward him. "My name is Robert Whitmore. My great-grandfather was superintendent of the boarding school from 1950 to 1958. Sarah felt her heart race as she recognized the surname from Thomas's letter. "3 weeks ago, my grandmother died," Whitmore continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "While cleaning out her house, I found a box of documents she'd kept hidden in her attic for decades. Letters, reports, and what appeared to be payment records involving my great-grandfather, Henry Patterson, Stan's grandfather, and Sheriff Kowalski." Mayor Patterson lunged toward his microphone. "Robert, I strongly advise you not to what, Stan? Not to tell the truth about what our families did?" Whitmore's voice carried an edge of anger that silenced Patterson's objection. "Not to admit that we've been living with blood money for 70 years. Whitmore reached into a briefcase and pulled out a manila folder thick with yellow documents. "The records show payments made to my great-grandfather for what they called special handling of problem students, children who repeatedly tried to escape, children who refused to abandon their native languages, children who were considered too difficult to manage through normal school discipline." David Running Bear stepped forward, his professional training overriding the emotional impact of what they were hearing. "Mr. Whitmore, those documents need to be turned over to federal investigators immediately. They constitute evidence in an ongoing murder investigation." "I contacted Agent Crawford an hour ago," Whitmore replied. "She's on her way here to collect them. But I wanted this community to hear the truth before it gets buried in federal bureaucracy again." He opened the folder and began reading from a document dated October 1954, just weeks after Thomas Running Bear's death. "Payment to J. Whitmore for special handling of escapee problem, $200. Final resolution achieved through cooperation with H. Patterson and Sheriff Kowalski. No further action required." The words fell into the silent room like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread through the crowd. Sarah watched faces change as people grasped the clinical language's horrifying meaning. Final resolution meant murder, special handling meant torture, and no further action required meant a cover-up that had lasted 7 decades. Mrs. Henderson stood up again, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had lived through history and refused to let it be rewritten. There were 12 children who disappeared from that school between 1952 and 1956, 12 families who were told their children had run away or been transferred, 12 sets of parents who died not knowing what happened to their babies. "Mrs. Henderson," Patterson began, but the elderly woman cut him off with a gesture that carried surprising authority. "I worked as a secretary at the county courthouse during those years, Stan Patterson. I processed the paperwork when your grandfather purchased additional mineral rights to expand the mine operation. I always wondered why he needed access to areas that had already been mined out." She turned to face the crowd. "Now I know. He needed places to hide bodies." The community center erupted again, but this time the anger was directed at the Patterson family rather than at Sarah and her companions. Voices rose in demands for answers, accusations flying between neighbors as 70 years of carefully maintained silence shattered like glass. Agent Crawford entered the building at that moment, accompanied by a team of federal agents and forensic specialists. The sight of federal law enforcement caused immediate tension, but Crawford's calm professionalism managed to prevent the situation from escalating into confrontation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crawford announced, her voice carrying easily over the crowd noise, "I need to inform you that the FBI investigation has expanded significantly. Ground-penetrating radar has identified multiple burial sites throughout the Clearwater mine complex. We are now investigating what appears to be a systematic pattern of murder spanning several years." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah saw people sink into their chairs, others cover their faces with their hands, and several individuals quietly leave through the back exits. Crawford continued with the dispassionate delivery of someone presenting evidence in a courtroom. "Additionally, we have recovered documents from the Whitmore family that provide detailed records of the conspiracy to murder Native American children and conceal their deaths. These documents implicate not only the 3 individuals named in Thomas Running Bear's letter, but also several other community members who were aware of and participated in the cover-up." Mayor Patterson's voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke into his microphone. "Agent Crawford, are you saying there will be charges filed against living individuals?" "Mayor Patterson, I'm saying that murder has no statute of limitations. Anyone who participated in these crimes, facilitated the cover-up, or received benefits from the conspiracy faces potential federal prosecution." The implications crashed over the room like an avalanche. Sarah realized they were witnessing the collapse of not just individual families' reputations, but the entire foundation of Cedar Falls' identity as a community. The town had been built, quite literally, on the graves of murdered children. David Running Bear stepped forward, his voice carrying both his professional authority and his family's generational pain. "Agent Crawford, when will Thomas Running Bear be released to his family for burial?" "Dr. Running Bear, forensic analysis is complete. Thomas can be released immediately." Crawford paused, looking around the room at the faces of people whose world had just been shattered. "However, I want the community of Cedar Falls to understand something clearly. This investigation is just beginning. We expect to identify the remains of at least 11 additional children, and we will not rest until every family knows what happened to their child." William Running Bear entered the community center at that moment, followed by Margaret Running Bear and a dozen other family members. Their presence transformed the atmosphere in the room from one of crisis management to one of ceremonial gravity. These were not protesters or activists. They were grieving family members who had finally received answers to questions that had haunted them for 7 decades. William approached the microphone that Mayor Patterson had abandoned, his elderly frame carrying the dignity of someone who had lived through more than most people could imagine. "People of Cedar Falls," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "we did not come here seeking revenge. We came seeking our grandson, our nephew, our brother, who was taken from us 70 years ago. We found him, and we found the truth about what happened to him." He paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected shock, shame, and the dawning realization that their community's history was far different from what they'd been taught. But we also found something else. We found that the pain we carried for 7 decades was shared by 11 other families whose children disappeared into the darkness of this place. Tomorrow, we take Thomas home to be buried with honor among his people. But we will not stop there. We will help find the other children, and we will ensure that their families know the truth. Margaret Running Bear stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of age and loss. The children who died here were more than victims. They were sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, each with a name and a spirit and a family who loved them. Thomas was called Soaring Hawk, and his spirit will finally be free to fly home. But the other children deserve the same honor, the same justice, the same homecoming. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks as she watched the Running Bear family transform what could have been a confrontation into something approaching reconciliation. They were offering the community of Cedar Falls a path forward, a way to face the truth about its past while working toward justice for all the victims. Agent Crawford announced that the community center would serve as a temporary information collection point for anyone with knowledge about missing children from the boarding school era. Federal investigators would be stationed there for the remainder of the week, taking statements and collecting evidence. As the meeting dispersed, Sarah found herself surrounded by people she'd known her entire life, some offering support, others asking questions, a few expressing anger that she'd brought this trouble to their quiet community. But increasingly, she encountered expressions of gratitude from people who said they'd always wondered about the stories they'd heard, always felt that something wasn't right about the official explanations for the missing children. The drive back to her ranch took place in contemplative silence. David Running Bear and his companions seemed drained by the evening's revelations, processing not just the confirmation of Thomas's fate, but the knowledge that he had not been alone in his suffering. As they crested the hill leading to Sarah's property, they could see the lights of the Running Bear family camp spread across the landscape like a small village. Tomorrow would bring the ceremony to take Thomas home, but tonight was for processing the magnitude of what they had uncovered and what it would mean for both communities going forward. The truth had finally been told, but Sarah understood that truth was only the beginning. Justice for Thomas Running Bear and the other children would require sustained effort, legal proceedings that could take years, and the difficult work of helping two communities, one Native American, one white, find a way to move forward together from a shared tragedy. But as she looked at the lights of the camp where Thomas's family waited to take him home, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since finding his letter in the burial chamber. Hope that justice delayed might not necessarily be justice denied. Dawn broke over Sarah's ranch with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes to the Montana mountains in early autumn. The Running Bear family camp had been active since before sunrise, preparing for the ceremony that would finally bring Thomas Soaring Hawk home to his people after 70 years of waiting in the darkness. Sarah stood on her front porch, watching the careful preparations unfold across her property. What she witnessed was unlike anything she had ever seen, a blend of ancient tradition and modern necessity, spiritual ceremony and legal procedure, grief and celebration intertwined in ways that spoke to resilience beyond her understanding. Traditional burial scaffold had been constructed during the night, built from lodgepole pine and decorated with items that connected Thomas to both his heritage and the life he might have lived. Eagle feathers caught the morning breeze alongside a small metal toy truck, one of the artifacts found with his remains, representing the child he had been when his life was stolen. Colorful ribbons danced next to modern photographs of the family, members he had never had the chance to meet. Dr. David Running Bear emerged from the burial chamber for the final time, carrying a specially prepared container that held Thomas's remains. The forensic work was complete, every bone documented, every artifact catalogued, every piece of evidence preserved for the legal proceedings that would follow. But now, science stepped aside for ceremony, and Thomas Running Bear was no longer evidence in a federal investigation. He was a child coming home to his family. William Running Bear stood beside the scaffold, dressed in traditional regalia that seemed to transform him from an elderly man into a conduit between past and present. His voice carried across the assembled crowd as he began speaking in Lakota, the ancient words flowing like water over stones worn smooth by time. Sarah didn't understand the language, but she felt the power of prayers that had sustained his people through centuries of struggle. Margaret Running Bear stepped forward, carrying a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "Thomas," she said, her voice clear in the morning air, "we have come to take you home. Your grandfather Joseph never stopped looking for you. He searched until the day he died, and his spirit has been waiting with you until we could find you both." The ceremony continued with songs that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, voices harmonizing in ways that spoke of oral traditions passed down through generations. Sarah found herself crying, not from sadness, but from witnessing something profound: the power of love to transcend death, the strength of family bonds to survive decades of separation, the beauty of a culture that refused to let its children be forgotten. Agent Crawford stood at a respectful distance, along with several federal agents who had requested permission to witness the ceremony. Their presence represented more than professional courtesy. It acknowledged that Thomas Running Bear's homecoming was also a victory for justice, proof that truth could survive even the most determined efforts to bury it. As the morning ceremony concluded, vehicles began arriving from Cedar Falls. Sarah was surprised to see familiar faces among the newcomers: Mrs. Henderson, Robert Whitmore, and a growing number of community members who had spent the night grappling with revelations that had shattered their understanding of their town's history. Mrs. Henderson approached William Running Bear with the careful respect of someone seeking forgiveness for wrongs she had not personally committed, but felt responsible for as a member of the community that had failed Thomas. "Mr. Running Bear," she said, her voice carrying the weight of her 87 years, "I want you to know that not everyone in Cedar Falls knew what had happened, but that doesn't excuse those of us who could have asked harder questions, who could have demanded better answers when children disappeared." William studied her face with eyes that seemed to see through surface words to deeper intentions. "Mrs. Henderson, you are here now. You are bearing witness to Thomas coming home. That matters more than what you didn't know 70 years ago." Robert Whitmore stepped forward, carrying a wooden box that contained the documents he had discovered in his grandmother's attic. "Agent Crawford, these belong to the investigation now. But first, I wanted the Running Bear family to know that my great-grandfather kept detailed records. There are names, dates, locations, everything needed to find the other children. David." Running Bear accepted the box with the careful handling of someone who understood they were receiving evidence of both atrocity and hope. "Mr. Whitmore, these records will help us bring 11 other children home to their families. Your courage in coming forward honors their memory." The formal transfer of documents marked a turning point in the morning's events. What had begun as a private family ceremony was evolving into something larger, a community acknowledgement of historical wrongs and a commitment to make them right. Agent Crawford announced that the FBI investigation had already expanded beyond the original crime scene. Ground-penetrating radar had identified burial sites throughout the old mining complex, and forensic teams were preparing to begin systematic excavation. The process would take months, possibly years, but every child would be found and properly identified. Additionally, Crawford continued, addressing both the Running Bear family and the Cedar Falls residents, we have identified 3 living individuals who participated in the cover-up of these crimes. Federal warrants will be issued this afternoon. Sarah felt a chill as she realized that justice for Thomas and the other children would require prosecuting people she had known her entire life, elderly individuals who had spent decades as respected community members. Their participation in historical atrocities hidden beneath layers of ordinary respectability. The weight of these implications was interrupted by the arrival of a convoy of vehicles unlike any that had appeared on Sarah's ranch before. Cars and trucks from multiple reservations across Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota filled her access road and surrounding fields. Word of Thomas's discovery and homecoming had spread throughout Native American communities, drawing families whose own children had disappeared into the boarding school system. Margaret Running Bear watched the arriving vehicles with an expression of deep satisfaction. "Thomas will not go home alone," she said to Sarah. "Every family that lost a child to these schools will be represented when we take him to his resting place." The procession that formed as the morning progressed was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed. More than 200 vehicles stretched along the county roads, carrying people who had traveled hundreds of miles to honor a child they had never met, but whose story represented the experiences of thousands of children stolen from their families and cultures. The destination was a traditional burial ground on the Crow Reservation, a place where Thomas's great-great-grandparents were buried, and where his spirit could finally find peace among his ancestors. The site had been prepared according to customs that predated European contact, ensuring that Thomas's homecoming honored both his individual identity and his connection to generations of Lakota people. As the procession prepared to depart, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She asked William Running Bear if she could accompany the family to the burial ground, not as an observer, but as someone who had become part of Thomas's story through her discovery of his remains. "Sarah Mitchell," William said, using her full name with the formality of ceremony, "you gave our grandson a voice when he could no longer speak for himself. You made sure his story was heard when others wanted to keep it buried. You have earned the right to see him safely home." The journey to the reservation took 2 hours, the long procession moving at a pace that allowed for dignity rather than speed. Sarah rode with David Running Bear, watching the Montana landscape unfold around them, mountains and prairies that had witnessed the entire tragic history of contact between Native American peoples and European settlers. The burial ground itself was situated on a hillside overlooking the Yellowstone River, with views that stretched to distant mountain ranges. Ancient cottonwood trees provided shade for headstones that marked graves spanning more than a century, creating a visual timeline of Lakota history written in stone and memory. The final ceremony began as the sun reached its zenith, with Thomas's remains placed in a traditional burial scaffold that would allow his spirit to ascend to the sky world. The ritual was conducted entirely in Lakota, but Sarah understood its meaning through the emotions visible on every face present. Grief for a life cut short, joy for a homecoming finally achieved, determination that Thomas's story would never be forgotten. William Running Bear spoke the final words in English, ensuring that everyone present could understand the promise being made to Thomas and the other children yet to be found. "Thomas Running Bear, whose spirit name was Soaring Hawk, you are home now among your people. Your suffering is ended, your wait is over, your story has been told. We promise you that the other children who died with you will also come home. We promise you that those who took your life will face justice. We promise you that your name and your courage will be remembered as long as our people endure." As the ceremony concluded, Sarah realized that her role in Thomas's story was also ending. The discovery that had begun with a desperate search for copper in an abandoned mine had become something she never could have imagined. A catalyst for historical justice, a bridge between communities, a testament to the power of truth to survive even the most determined efforts to suppress it. Agent Crawford approached Sarah as families began the long journey back to their homes. "Ms. Mitchell, the investigation will continue for months, probably years. We'll need your continued cooperation as a witness and as the property owner where the crimes occurred." "You'll have it," Sarah replied without hesitation. Thomas waited. 70 years for justice. I can wait as long as it takes to make sure he gets it. The federal prosecutions that followed made national news, bringing unwanted attention to Cedar Falls, but also forcing a reckoning with historical crimes that had been hidden for too long. 3 elderly residents were charged with conspiracy to commit murder and violation of civil rights, their trials revealing the systematic nature of violence against Native American children in the boarding school system. Over the following months, the remains of 11 additional children were recovered from the Clearwater mine complex. Each child was identified through forensic analysis and historical records. Each family was contacted, and each homecoming was conducted with the same dignity and ceremony that had marked Thomas's return to his people. Sarah's ranch became a pilgrimage, site of sorts, with families traveling from across the country to see the place where their relatives had been found and to participate in ceremonies honoring the children's memories. The old copper mine was eventually sealed and designated as a memorial site, with a monument listing the names of all 12 children who had been murdered there. The financial struggles that had driven Sarah to search the mine in the first place were resolved through an unexpected source. The Running Bear family and other tribal communities raised funds to purchase her ranch and establish it as a permanent memorial and educational center. Sarah was hired as the site's director, ensuring that Thomas's story and the stories of the other children would be preserved and shared with future generations. On quiet evenings, Sarah often walked out to the memorial that marked the entrance to the old mine. The monument was simple but powerful, 12 names carved in black granite, with a larger inscription that read, "In memory of the children who died calling for home. Their voices have been heard, their stories will not be forgotten." Thomas Running Bear's name was at the top of the list, followed by his spirit name, Soaring Hawk. Below the names, a final line captured the essence of what his discovery had meant. They are home now among their people, where they belong. Sarah had discovered far more than copper in the depths of the abandoned mine. She had found proof that truth, like the human spirit, could survive even the darkest attempts to bury it. She had found that justice, however delayed, could still find its way to light. And she had found that sometimes when we search for one thing, we discover something far more valuable: the power of story to heal, the strength of community to change, and the enduring love of families who never stop looking for their lost children. Thomas Running Bear, Soaring Hawk, had finally come home. And in doing so, he had helped heal wounds that had festered for 70 years, bringing justice not just for himself, but for 11 other children whose names could finally be spoken, whose stories could finally be told, and whose families could finally lay them to rest among their own people, where they belonged. 5 years after Thomas Running Bear's homecoming, the ramifications of his discovery continued to reshape both Cedar Falls and the broader conversation about historical justice in America. What had begun as Sarah Mitchell's desperate search for copper had become a catalyst for the largest federal investigation into boarding school-era crimes in U.S. history. The Thomas Running Bear Memorial and Education Center had evolved into something far beyond what anyone had initially envisioned. Built on the site of Sarah's former ranch, the facility now welcomed over 50,000 visitors annually. Families seeking information about missing relatives, researchers studying the boarding school system, and international delegations examining America's reckoning with its treatment of indigenous peoples. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the center's chief historian, stood before a group of visiting European journalists on a crisp October morning, explaining the ongoing archaeological work at the site. "What makes this location unique," she said, gesturing toward the sealed mine entrance, now marked by an elegant memorial wall, is not just that we found evidence of systematic murder, but that we discovered a paper trail documenting the entire conspiracy. The Whitmore documents had proven to be even more damning than initially realized. Federal investigators had used them to trace similar operations at boarding schools across 12 states, leading to the discovery of mass burial sites from Oregon to Oklahoma. The scandal had prompted congressional hearings, formal apologies from 3 state governments, and a $2.3 billion federal compensation fund for affected families. Agent Crawford, now retired from the FBI but serving as a consultant to the ongoing investigations, joined Dr. Vasquez for the morning briefing. The Thomas Running Bear case broke open what we now understand was a nationwide network of corruption, violence and cover-ups spanning nearly a century. We've identified over 400 additional victims, with investigations ongoing at 73 former boarding school sites. The legal proceedings had been equally unprecedented. The 3 elderly Cedar Falls residents charged in connection with Thomas's murder had all been convicted, though 2 died before completing their sentences. More significantly, their trials had established legal precedents, allowing federal prosecution of historical crimes against Native Americans, leading to dozens of additional cases nationwide. But it was the cultural impact that proved most transformative. Sarah, now in her 6th year as the Memorial Center's director, had watched as the site became a pilgrimage destination for families across Indian country. The center's genealogy research program had reunited over 200 families with information about relatives who had disappeared into the boarding school system. This particular morning brought a visitor who represented the ongoing nature of the center's work. James Crow Feather, a 78-year-old Lakota elder from South Dakota, had driven 12 hours to Cedar Falls with his granddaughter, seeking information about his younger brother who had vanished from a boarding school in 1957. My brother's name was Daniel Crow Feather, James explained to Sarah as they sat in the center's family research room. He was 8 years old when they took him to the Riverside Indian School in South Dakota. The last letter we got from him was in October 1957, saying he was going to try to come home for winter ceremonies. We never saw him again. Sarah consulted the center's database, cross-referencing missing children reports with the expanding network of information that had emerged from similar investigations across the region. The database now contained over 3,000 entries, each representing a child whose disappearance had been dismissed or ignored by authorities at the time. Mr. Crow Feather, I'm showing that Daniel's name appears in transfer records from Riverside to the Cedar Falls School in November 1957, Sarah said carefully. The records indicate he was brought here for what officials called intensive cultural adjustment therapy. James's granddaughter, Dr. Rebecca Crow Feather, leaned forward with the focused attention of someone accustomed to processing difficult information. As a forensic anthropologist who had worked on several boarding school excavations, she understood the euphemistic language used to describe the violence inflicted on Native children. Was Daniel one of the children found in the mine? She asked. Sarah nodded slowly. The forensic evidence suggests Daniel arrived at Cedar Falls in November 1957 and died within 3 weeks. His remains were among those recovered from the mine complex. We've been hoping a family member would come forward so we could return him to your family. The emotional weight of finally receiving answers after 66 years of uncertainty filled the small research room. James Crow Feather wept quietly as his granddaughter held his hand, both of them processing the mixture of grief and relief that came with ending decades of not knowing. "Can we take Daniel home?" Rebecca asked. The remains were released to the Crow Nation 5 years ago, since we didn't have family contact information at the time, Sarah explained. But we can arrange for a proper transfer ceremony. This happens more often than you might think. Families finding us years after their Relatives had been laid to rest. The afternoon brought a different kind of visitor to the memorial center. Thomas Patterson, the 32-year-old great-grandson of the mine owner who had participated in Thomas Running Bear's murder, had requested a private meeting with the Running Bear family representatives. Thomas Patterson carried himself with the careful bearing of someone who had spent years grappling with inherited shame. A successful environmental lawyer from Seattle, he had legally changed his surname from his family name 5 years earlier, seeking to distance himself from his great-grandfather's legacy while still acknowledging his connection to the crimes. William Running Bear, now 87 but still sharp as mountain air, agreed to meet with Patterson in the center's meditation garden. The space had been designed as a place for reflection and healing, with native plants and traditional elements that honored both Lakota spiritual traditions and the broader indigenous heritage of the region. "Mr. Running Bear," Patterson began, his voice carrying the weight of words he had been practicing for months, "I can't apologize for crimes I didn't commit, but I can acknowledge the pain my family caused and accept responsibility for how we've benefited from those crimes." William studied the young man's face, with eyes that had seen too much history to be impressed by words alone. "What is it you want, Mr. Patterson?" "I want to establish a scholarship fund in Thomas's memory. My family made money from the mine operation that covered up his murder. I want that money to go towards supporting Native American students pursuing education in fields that serve their communities: law, medicine, education, social work." "How much money?" $2 million initially, with an additional $1 million annually for the next 20 years. William was quiet for several minutes, processing not just the financial commitment, but what it represented: a member of the perpetrator's family taking concrete action to address historical wrongs rather than simply offering symbolic gestures. "Mr. Patterson, money cannot bring back Thomas or any of the other children, but education can prevent future atrocities by ensuring our people have the knowledge and power to protect themselves. If you are serious about this commitment, we will work with you." The scholarship program, announced 6 months later, became a model for other historical justice initiatives across the country. The Thomas Running Bear Educational Foundation provided full scholarships for Native American students, with preference given to those from families affected by the boarding school system. The program's first recipient was Maria Two Eagles, a 20-year-old Lakota woman whose great-grandfather had been murdered at a boarding school in North Dakota in 1954. She was accepted to Harvard Law School with plans to specialize in federal Indian law and historical justice cases. "Thomas Running Bear died trying to preserve his identity and return to his family," Maria said at the scholarship award ceremony. "This scholarship allows me to pursue the education that will help prevent other families from experiencing what his family endured." The ripple effects of Thomas's discovery continued expanding in unexpected directions. The International Court of Justice in The Hague cited the Running Bear case in a ruling about historical crimes against indigenous peoples. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in 3 countries requested testimony from investigators involved. In the case, UNESCO designated the Memorial Center as a World Heritage Site, recognizing sites of historical significance related to indigenous rights. But perhaps the most meaningful development came from an unexpected source. The Vatican, facing pressure over its own historical role in operating boarding schools, announced a formal investigation into the Catholic Church's involvement in the systematic abuse of Native American children. Pope Francis personally visited the Memorial Center, becoming the first pontiff to formally acknowledge the Church's participation in cultural genocide. The children who died here and at institutions like this across the Americas died because adults charged with their care chose cruelty over compassion, cultural destruction over education, violence over love, the Pope said during his visit. Their deaths demand not just our sorrow, but our commitment to ensuring such atrocities never happen again. The papal visit brought international attention to the Memorial Center, but it also highlighted the ongoing nature of the work being done there. Each month brought new families seeking information about missing relatives, new evidence of crimes at other institutions, new legal cases requiring expert testimony about the systematic nature of the violence. Dr. David Running Bear, now recognized as one of the nation's leading experts on boarding school archaeology, had established a training program at the Memorial Center for Forensic Anthropologists and Tribal Historians. The program ensured that future excavations would be conducted with both scientific rigor and cultural sensitivity. What we've learned from Thomas's case, David explained to a group of graduate students, is that these weren't random acts of violence. They were part of a systematic effort to destroy Native American cultures by eliminating the children who would have carried those cultures forward. Understanding that systematic nature is crucial to preventing similar atrocities in the future. The evening brought a different kind of gathering to the Memorial Center. Once a month, families who had found missing relatives through the center's research program met for what they called homecoming circles, informal gatherings where people shared stories, offered support, and celebrated the return of children to their families, even if that return came decades after death. James and Rebecca Crow-Feather attended their first homecoming circle 6 months after retrieving Daniel's remains. James spoke about the relief of finally knowing what had happened to his brother, while Rebecca discussed the forensic evidence that had allowed them to understand the circumstances of Daniel's death. For 66 years, our family wondered if Daniel was alive somewhere, if he'd forgotten us, if we'd failed him by not searching hard enough, James said to the circle of families. Learning the truth was painful, but not knowing was worse. Now Daniel is home with our ancestors, and our family's questions have been answered. Margaret Running Bear, now 92, and the last surviving member of Thomas's generation, listened to James's story with the deep attention of someone who understood both the pain of not knowing and the healing that could come with truth. Every child who comes home through this place honors Thomas's memory, she said in her closing words for the evening. Thomas died alone, but his discovery has ensured that hundreds of other children have returned to their families. His spirit name was Soaring Hawk, and like a hawk, he has helped guide his lost brothers and sisters back to their people. As the homecoming circle concluded and families began their journeys back to reservations across the region, Sarah walked out to the memorial wall one final time. The names of the 12 children found in the mine were illuminated by soft lighting. Their stories now known, their families now at peace. Thomas Running Bear's name remained at the top of the list, but it was no longer alone. Below his name, new plaques had been added over the years, listing the names of over 400 children whose remains had been found at boarding school sites across the country, children whose discoveries had been made possible by Thomas's story and the investigation it had sparked. The work was far from over. Federal investigators estimated that thousands of children remained unaccounted for, their disappearances lost in bureaucratic records and deliberate cover-ups spanning more than a century. But Thomas Running Bear's discovery had proven that truth could survive even the most determined efforts to bury it, and that families would never stop looking for their missing children. Standing before the memorial wall on a clear Montana night, with stars visible despite the subtle lighting, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that September morning when she first descended into the abandoned mine. She had been searching for copper to save her failing ranch, but instead had found something infinitely more valuable. Proof that love could transcend death, that justice could survive decades of delay, and that one child's courage to write a letter in his final moments could spark a movement that would bring hundreds of other children home to their families. Thomas Running Bear, Soaring Hawk, had indeed learned to fly, carrying with him not just his own story, but the stories of all the children who had died calling for home. His flight had become a migration, leading lost spirits back to their people and ensuring that their names would never be forgotten, their stories never again buried in darkness. 7 years after Thomas Running Bear's discovery, FBI Special Agent Marcus Thompson stood in a congressional hearing room holding a file that represented the most comprehensive investigation into systematic crimes against Native American children in U.S. history. The file contained evidence of a network that stretched far beyond the boarding schools, a conspiracy that had involved federal agencies, religious organizations, and private contractors in a coordinated effort to eliminate Native American culture by targeting its most vulnerable members. "Senators," Agent Thompson began, addressing the Senate Subcommittee on Indian Affairs, "what we initially believed was isolated criminal activity at the Cedar Falls boarding school has revealed itself to be part of a coordinated national program. Operating from 1935 to 1978, we have documented evidence of systematic murder, forced medical experimentation, and the trafficking of Native American children to private facilities where they disappeared from all official records." Senator Patricia Blackhorse, the first Native American woman to chair the subcommittee, leaned forward with the intensity of someone who understood they were hearing testimony that would reshape American history. "Agent Thompson, are you saying that the federal government was directly involved in these crimes?" "Senator, we have recovered documents from the National Archives showing that Bureau of Indian Affairs officials were not only aware of the killings, but actively facilitated them through a program code-named Cultural Integration Protocol. The SHE program was designed to identify Native children deemed irredeemable and transfer them to facilities where they could be eliminated without raising questions from their families or communities." The hearing room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about individual criminals or corrupt local officials. It was about a federal program designed to commit genocide against Native American children. Meanwhile, at the Thomas Running Bear Memorial Center, Sarah Mitchell was dealing with the practical consequences of these revelations. The center's phone lines had been overwhelmed for weeks as families across Indian country sought information about relatives who might have been victims of the expanded conspiracy. The small staff Sarah had built over 7 years was completely inadequate to handle the flood of inquiries. Dr. Rebecca Crow Feather, who had taken a leave of absence from her university position to help manage the crisis, worked alongside Sarah to process the hundreds of new case files that arrived daily. Each file represented a family that had waited decades for answers about missing children, and each deserved the same careful attention that had led to Thomas Running Bear's identification. "Sarah, we need to talk about scaling up operations," Rebecca said as they reviewed the latest batch of inquiries. "We're getting requests from families in Alaska, Hawaii, and even Canada. The scope of this investigation has grown beyond anything we can handle with our current resources." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being at the center of a historical reckoning. "The federal government has offered to fund a massive expansion, but I'm worried about maintaining the family-centered approach that's made this place special. Once bureaucrats take over, will families still feel welcome here?" Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Dr. Angela Redhawk, a Lakota physician who had served as Surgeon General under 2 presidents, had driven from Denver to discuss something she described as too sensitive for phone calls. Dr. Redhawk's presence commanded immediate attention. At 58, she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to briefing presidents and testifying before Congress. But as she settled into Sarah's office, her professional composure cracked slightly. Sarah, Rebecca, what I'm about to share with you cannot leave this room until we decide how to handle it, she began. The congressional investigation has uncovered something that goes beyond murder and cultural destruction. We found evidence that Native American children were used in medical experiments funded by pharmaceutical companies and government agencies. Sarah felt her stomach turn. What kind of experiments? Psychological conditioning studies, drug trials, surgical procedures, all conducted without consent or anesthesia in many cases. The children weren't just killed, Sarah, they were tortured in the name of science, and the data from those experiments was used to develop medications and treatments that generated billions of dollars in profits. Rebecca's forensic training allowed her to process the information with clinical detachment, but Sarah could see the rage building behind her professional facade. Dr. Redhawk, are you saying that some of the children we found show evidence of medical experimentation? I'm saying that forensic re-examination of remains from 17 boarding school sites has revealed surgical modifications, injection sites, and other evidence of medical procedures that were never documented in official records. The pharmaceutical companies involved buried the evidence for decades, but congressional investigators have recovered files showing detailed records of experiments conducted on children as young as 5 years old. The revelation added another layer of horror to an already overwhelming situation. Sarah thought about Thomas Running Bear's remains, wondering if the forensic analysis had missed evidence of experimentation. The idea that his suffering might have been even worse than they'd discovered made her feel physically sick. There's more, Dr. Redhawk continued. Some of the children weren't killed immediately. They were kept alive for months or years while being subjected to repeated procedures. The records suggest that at least 47 children at the Cedar Falls facility were used in long-term psychological experiments designed to test methods of cultural erasure. The office fell silent as the three women processed the magnitude of what they were discussing. This wasn't just about historical justice anymore. It was about corporate accountability for crimes that had generated enormous profits while devastating Native American communities. "What do you need from us?" Sarah asked finally. "The congressional investigation needs access to all the remains and artifacts recovered from the Cedar Falls site. We need to conduct new forensic analysis, specifically looking for evidence of medical experimentation. And we need your help in contacting families to explain what we've discovered and ask for their consent to additional testing." Rebecca shook, her head slowly. "Dr. Redhawk, these families have already been through the trauma of learning their children were murdered. Now we're asking them to face the possibility that those children were also tortured for profit. We're asking them to help us ensure that the full truth is told and that those responsible are held accountable. The pharmaceutical companies involved are still operating, still profiting from research that was built on the bodies of murdered Native children. Don't these families deserve to know that? Don't they deserve compensation for what was stolen from their children?" The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside Sarah's office. Through the window, they could see a convoy of black SUVs pulling up to the Memorial Center, followed by several news vans. The vehicles carried federal agents, but also representatives from what appeared to be a major law firm. Agent Crawford, now working as a private consultant, entered Sarah's office with an expression of barely controlled anger. "Ladies, we have a problem. 3 pharmaceutical companies have filed federal lawsuits attempting to block the congressional investigation. They're claiming that the statute of limitations has expired on any crimes that might have been committed, and they're seeking to prevent access to any records or evidence related to their historical research programs." Sarah felt a surge of rage, unlike anything she'd experienced since first reading Thomas Running Bear's letter. They're trying to cover it up again. They're trying to use the legal system to protect profits that were generated through the torture and murder of children, Crawford replied. But this time, they're not dealing with grieving families who have no resources to fight back. This time, they're facing federal prosecutors, congressional investigators, and some of the best civil rights attorneys in the country. Dr. Redhawk stood up with the bearing of someone preparing for battle. Agent Crawford, these companies have made a tactical error. By filing lawsuits, they've publicly acknowledged their connection to the boarding school experiments. They've opened themselves up to discovery requests that will expose everything they've tried to hide for decades. The legal battle that erupted over the following months captured national attention in ways that the original Thomas Running Bear case had not. The pharmaceutical company's attempts to suppress evidence backfired spectacularly, generating headlines about corporate cover-ups and historical crimes that reached international audiences. Native American legal advocates, led by organizations like the Native American Rights Fund, filed class action lawsuits seeking damages not just for the murdered children, but for the ongoing effects of cultural trauma on their communities. The cases argued that the profits generated from experiments on Native children had funded corporate growth that continued to benefit shareholders decades later. The Thomas Running Bear Memorial Center became the headquarters for coordinating legal strategy across multiple cases. Sarah found herself working with attorneys, forensic specialists, tribal leaders, and federal investigators in a collaboration that would have been unimaginable when she first descended into the abandoned mine. Maria Two Eagles, the first recipient of the Thomas Running Bear Scholarship, had completed her first year at Harvard Law School and returned to the Memorial Center as a summer intern. Her legal training, combined with her personal connection to the boarding school legacy, made her invaluable in helping families understand their rights and options. "Ms. Mitchell," Maria said during one of their strategy sessions, "I've been thinking about Thomas's letter and what it represents. He was 10 years old, terrified, dying alone in the dark, but he still found the courage to write down the truth about what happened to him. That letter has now led to the exposure of crimes that affected thousands of children across the country." Sarah nodded, thinking about the small piece of paper that had started everything. Thomas couldn't have known that his letter would lead to all this. But he wrote it anyway because he believed the truth mattered. "That's what we're fighting for now," Maria continued. "Not just justice for Thomas and the other children who were murdered, but the principle that truth matters more than profit, that children's lives matter more than corporate convenience, that historical crimes don't disappear just because time passes." The summer brought a breakthrough that changed everything. Federal investigators, working with international law enforcement agencies, discovered that the pharmaceutical experiments on Native American children had been connected to similar programs targeting indigenous peoples in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The boarding school system hadn't been an isolated American tragedy. It had been part of a global network of institutions designed to eliminate indigenous cultures through the systematic abuse of children. Dr. David Running Bear, now serving as a consultant to investigations on 3 continents, briefed Sarah and her team on the international dimensions of what they had uncovered. The companies involved weren't just American corporations. They were multinational enterprises that saw indigenous children as test subjects for experiments that would have been illegal if conducted on white populations. The revelation led to the formation of an International Indigenous Justice Commission, with headquarters established at the Thomas Running Bear Memorial Center. The Commission's mandate was to investigate historical crimes against indigenous peoples worldwide and coordinate legal action across national boundaries. Sarah, who had started her journey as a rancher, desperate to find copper to save her property, now found herself serving as executive director of an international human rights organization. The transformation was overwhelming, but she understood that Thomas Running Bear's story had always been bigger than one child, one family, or one community. Standing in her office late one evening, looking out at the memorial wall where Thomas's name still held the place of honor among hundreds of other children's names, Sarah reflected on how far they had come and how much work remained ahead. The pharmaceutical companies were fighting the lawsuits with teams of expensive attorneys, but they were losing ground as more evidence emerged of their historical crimes. Congressional investigators had uncovered documents showing that company executives knew they were using murdered children in their experiments and had actively participated in covering up the crimes. But beyond the legal battles and financial settlements, something more important was happening. Native American communities across the world were connecting with each other, sharing stories that had been suppressed for generations and building coalitions that could prevent future atrocities. Thomas Running Bear's letter, written by a dying child in the darkness of an abandoned mine, had become the foundation for a global movement demanding justice for indigenous peoples. His spirit name, Soaring Hawk, had proven prophetic. His story had indeed taken flight, carrying with it the voices of thousands of other children who had been silenced but not forgotten. The work was far from over, but Sarah understood that they had reached a tipping point. The truth about the boarding school system and its connections to corporate profits and government programs could no longer be suppressed. The families who had waited decades for answers were finally seeing justice, and the companies that had profited from their children's suffering were finally being held accountable. Thomas Running Bear had waited 70 years for someone to hear his story. Now, 7 years after his letter was found, his voice was being heard around the world. 10 years after Sarah Mitchell first descended into the Clearwater mine, the world gathered at the Thomas Running Bear Memorial Center for an unprecedented ceremony. Representatives from 47 nations had come to witness the signing of the International Indigenous Children's Protection Treaty, a document that established global legal protections for indigenous children and created mechanisms for prosecuting historical crimes against indigenous peoples. The treaty had emerged directly from the investigations sparked by Thomas Running Bear's letter, investigations that had ultimately documented systematic crimes against indigenous children on 6 continents. Spanning more than a century, the pharmaceutical companies that had fought so desperately to suppress evidence of their experiments had not only lost their legal battles but faced criminal charges in multiple countries. President Jennifer Martinez stood at the podium where Thomas's memorial wall provided a backdrop of names that had grown to include over 1,200 children whose remains had been identified through the Global Investigation Network. As the first Native American president in U.S. history, Martinez understood the symbolic weight of the moment in ways that transcended politics. Today, we do more than acknowledge historical wrongs, President Martinez began, her voice carrying across the assembled dignitaries and family members. Today, we establish that crimes against indigenous children are crimes against humanity, regardless of when they were committed or who committed them. Today, we ensure that no child will ever again disappear into institutions designed to erase their identity. Sarah Mitchell, now 54 and bearing the weathered dignity of someone who had spent a decade at the center of historical transformation, watched from the front row alongside the Running Bear family. William Running Bear, at 97, had lived to see his great-nephew's story reshape international law. His presence at the ceremony represented not just family pride, but the endurance of indigenous peoples through centuries of attempted genocide. The treaty signing was the culmination of legal battles that had fundamentally altered corporate accountability law. The landmark case of Running Bear versus Blackstone Pharmaceuticals had resulted in a $47 billion settlement, the largest corporate penalty in history for historical crimes. The money had funded not just compensation for affected families, but educational, scholarships, healthcare programs, and cultural preservation initiatives across indigenous communities worldwide. Dr. Maria II Eagles, now a practicing attorney specializing in international indigenous rights law, had argued the final appeals that established the legal precedent allowing prosecution of corporations for historical crimes against indigenous peoples. Standing at the podium to address the assembly, she embodied the transformation that education and justice could achieve. Thomas Running Bear died alone in the darkness, but his story has brought light to crimes that powerful people spent fortunes trying to keep hidden, Maria said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had helped reshape international law. The children whose names are on this memorial wall behind me did not die in vain. Their suffering has created protections for indigenous children that will last for generations. The pharmaceutical executives who had orchestrated the cover-up attempts were notably absent from the ceremony. 3 former CEOs were serving federal prison sentences for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, while their companies had been forced to establish permanent funds for indigenous healthcare and education as part of their settlement agreements. But the treaty signing represented more than corporate accountability. It established new international institutions designed to prevent future atrocities. The Thomas Running Bear Institute for Indigenous Rights, with headquarters in Geneva and regional offices on every continent, had been granted authority to investigate threats to indigenous children and coordinate international responses. Dr. Rebecca Crow-Feather, who had left her university position to serve as the Institute's first director, explained the organization's mission to the gathered diplomats. We exist to ensure that no indigenous child ever again disappears without the world taking notice. We exist to ensure that families like mine, who spent 66 years wondering what happened to our children, receive answers quickly rather than after generations of suffering. The ceremony included the unveiling of a new section of the memorial wall, this one bearing the names of children who had been found alive through the investigations, survivors of the boarding school system who had been presumed dead but located, living under different identities in institutions across multiple countries. The discovery of living survivors had been one of the most unexpected outcomes of the global investigation. Among those survivors was an 82-year-old Cree woman named Eleanor Brightstar, who had been taken from her family in Saskatchewan at age 6 and spent her entire life believing her family was dead. The investigation had not only reunited her with surviving relatives, but revealed that she had been subjected to experimental psychological treatments designed to erase her memory of her native language and culture. For 76 years, I believed I was alone in the world, Eleanor said during the ceremony, speaking in the Cree language she had secretly maintained despite decades of punishment for using it. Today, I stand with my granddaughter and great-grandchildren, knowing that Thomas Running Bear's courage to write that letter saved not just other children's memory, but my own life's meaning. The international scope of the investigations had revealed that the boarding school system was just one component of a coordinated effort to eliminate indigenous cultures through child removal. Similar programs had operated in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Norway, and dozens of other countries, all following remarkably similar patterns of family separation, cultural destruction, and institutional abuse. Agent Crawford, now in her 70s, but still sharp as the mountain air that surrounded the memorial, had become the unofficial historian of the global investigation. Her final report, released to coincide with the treaty signing, documented crimes against an estimated 50,000 indigenous children across 47 countries between 1850 and 1980. What began as a local murder investigation in Montana had revealed the largest systematic crime against children in recorded history, Crawford told the international media covering the ceremony. But more importantly, it has demonstrated that truth has a power that no amount of money or influence can permanently suppress. The treaty itself contained provisions that would have been unthinkable when Sarah first found Thomas's letter. Established universal jurisdiction for crimes against indigenous children, meaning that perpetrators could be prosecuted in any signatory country, regardless of where their crimes were committed. It created mandatory reporting systems for missing indigenous children, with international monitoring to prevent cover-ups. And it established permanent funding for family reunification and cultural restoration programs. But perhaps most significantly, the treaty recognized indigenous peoples' inherent right to protect their children according to their own cultural traditions, effectively ending the legal justification that had allowed forced assimilation programs to operate for more than a century. As the ceremony moved toward its conclusion, Sarah found herself thinking about the letter that had started everything, a piece of paper written by a dying child who had no way of knowing that his words would eventually reshape international law. Thomas Running Bear had asked his family to remember that his spirit name was Soaring Hawk, and his flight had indeed carried other voices to safety. The final speaker was Margaret Running Bear, now 98 and the last living person who had known Thomas before his disappearance. Her words, delivered in both Lakota and English, served as a benediction for a decade of struggle and transformation. My great-nephew Thomas was 10 years old when they killed him for trying to come home to his family, she said, her voice still strong despite her advanced age. He died believing that love was stronger than hatred, that truth was more powerful than lies, and that his people would never stop looking for him. Today, we see that he was right about all of those things. As the formal ceremony concluded, families began the personal rituals that had become tradition at the memorial center. They placed offerings at the memorial wall, shared stories about relatives who had been found through the investigations, and made plans for ongoing efforts to locate children who remained missing. Sarah walked through the crowds, greeting families she had worked with over the years, and meeting new faces representing communities just beginning their own searches for missing children. The work would continue. It had to continue, because the investigations had revealed that thousands of children remained unaccounted for in archives and burial sites around the world. The Thomas Running Bear Memorial Center had evolved far beyond what anyone had imagined when it was first established. It now served as headquarters for a global network of researchers, attorneys, investigators, and family advocates working to complete the task that Thomas's letter had begun. The center's database contained information about over 30,000 missing indigenous children, with new cases added regularly as communities gained access to historical records that had been sealed for decades. Dr. David Running Bear, now 68 and recognized as the world's leading expert on boarding school archaeology, had trained hundreds of forensic specialists in techniques for locating and identifying historical burial sites. His protocols had been adopted by investigations on every continent, ensuring that the recovery of indigenous children's remains would be conducted with both scientific rigor and cultural respect. The evening brought a private gathering for the families who had been most directly affected by the discoveries at the Clearwater mine. The 12 families whose children had been found in the original excavation came together annually to honor their children's memory and celebrate the ongoing impact of their discoveries. William Running Bear, supported by family members, but still insisting on standing for the ceremony, offered the final words of the day. Thomas and the other children who died here have taught us that death cannot silence truth, that love cannot be destroyed by hatred, and that justice, even when delayed, can still find its way to light. As stars appeared over the Montana mountains, Sarah stood one final time before the memorial wall where Thomas Running Bear's name held its place of honor. The child who had died calling for his grandfather had become the voice for thousands of other children, the catalyst for changes that had reshaped international law, and the inspiration for a global movement that continued to grow. Thomas Running Bear, Soaring Hawk, had indeed learned to fly. His flight had carried him far beyond the darkness of the mine shaft where he died, beyond the borders of reservations and nations, beyond the limitations of time and mortality. His voice, preserved in a letter written with a child's careful handwriting, had become a chorus singing of justice, remembrance, and hope. The work that began with Sarah's desperate search for copper in an abandoned mine would continue for generations to come. But Thomas Running Bear's part in that work was complete. He had delivered his message, found his family, and brought his brothers and sisters home. His spirit was finally free to soar among the ancestors who had been waiting to welcome him home. In death as in life, Thomas Running Bear had refused to let them erase who he was. His victory was not just personal, it was a victory for every indigenous child who had ever been told to forget their name, abandon their language, or deny their heritage. His letter had become a declaration that indigenous children belonged with their families, their cultures, and their communities, not in institutions designed to destroy what made them who they were. The mine shaft was sealed now, transformed from a place of death into a site of remembrance. But Thomas's story continued to echo across the world, carrying with it the voices of children who had been silenced but never forgotten, and the promise that truth, like the human spirit, could not be buried forever. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.